And thank you to all of our speakers. We're going to invite them up now for a panel discussion. So join me in re-welcoming them to the panel. Okay, so I'm going to start us off with a few questions, and then we'll take questions from the wider community here. And we're going to prioritize first questions that address the research of more than one of the participants going along with the theme of interdependence and relationships here. So we're going to try to relate some of these talks to each other. So one finding that I thought was really fascinating in the work that Hana, that you brought up, was this effect of the treatment where there was a local negative effect in the number of ties that the individuals who were actually in the treatment group had versus this kind of positive effect for the whole network, right, for the relationship structure. And that's something that I wondered about in all of your work, how you balance or how you think about the kinds of outcomes that are when you have different kinds of effects, let's say on the same variable that is influencing individuals versus the unit, whether that's a couple or a family or a group. So could you speak to that?
Sure, I'll start. I think one thing that's interesting in sociology, there's a concept of vacancy chains that often is associated with labor markets, where if you have these downstream effects of openings and people moving between positions later. And what I think this shows is that we don't see a vacancy chain effect in the case of changing network ties. You might expect that the ties of the people in the treatment group who are churning actually also churn, because it's a feature that they're connected to the people who are changing the most. But actually what we find is if you look at the peers of these treated students, whether or not they're influential, they actually have the most stability over time. So it's sort of I think there's a way to sort of say something about the effect of the message is sort of an ideational effect of the program, which was a lot about supporting your friends and supporting other students, that ends up being stronger, at least in this particular case, than the sort of just churning that or a ripple effect that sort of moves outward.
So in our research, where we'll do a couple level intervention, we'll have dyadic measures of change, like communication quality with a couple level variable, but then we'll also be able to look at individual change in terms of satisfaction, how well they change on the perception of the leader, a leader alliance, that sort of thing. But one of the really interesting things about and we didn't really talk about sex differences and gender differences in your research, but in the couples area, one of the findings across the board, particularly with opposite sex couples, we know less about same-sex couples, is that the women in the relationships, their satisfaction is associated with positive interactions more than negative interactions. And for men, it's the opposite. So men's satisfaction correlated more with how the negatives are going and less so with the positives, which is one of the reasons why women file for divorce more than men at a 3-to-1 ratio, because men are satisfied with a stable relationship. It doesn't have to be a great relationship. Women in general are not. So it's the women who call. So therefore, to get to your question, or to try to answer it a bit, that so you can get equal change in the positive connections rated by each partner, but for women, that change is going to be more associated with how happy they are with their relationship, and the opposite with men in terms of the negative communication, that decreasing the conflict, not going to be that great for the women in terms of how happy they are, but the men, they really like that. So anyway, I never really thought about it in the way that you asked about it, but really interesting. I don't know if that fits everybody's experience, but that's what we find.
I'm spending a lot of time trying to think of interesting behavioral tasks that we can use to get at these types of metrics in the voles, if that's even feasible or possible. In some ways, so voles are an amazing model for understanding what's going on in these dyadic bonds and to some extent within family structures. But one of the things that's a little bit different between voles and humans is that when they form these dyadic bonds, they basically don't want to be with any other unrelated adult prairie voles. And so it's harder to see the so-called churn through, say, a social structure, for instance. Perhaps I'll answer your question by not answering your question. And just say that one of the things I think is a commonality between our model and some of what was proposed today, especially as relates to offspring, is that in the prairie voles, there have done a number of manipulations. Does it matter if you have one parent or two parents? And the short answer is that at the end of the day, the stability seems to be the most important factor because there's not big changes that result from not having the dad present, which is, we can't do the mom not present because she's their food source. So having a single parent is not that big a deal. What is a problem is if we take them away from the mom for 3 hours at a time daily at different times of day. It's that lack of stability that seems to be really important.
Can you model conflict between the voles? You get huddling, but...
Yeah, I mean, if you want to overly anthropomorphize their behavior, they do engage in this sort of like dyadic, it's not fighting, it's more like going backwards and forwards and trying to convince each other to do things. My favorite video is actually a colleague of mine who has a vole pup, and the dad brings it over to one side of the cage and puts it down. Mom picks it up, brings it back over to the other side. And they do this for a few minutes because they just can't agree where the pup should go within the cage. But getting that behavior to be robustly demonstrated across multiple pairs of voles is more like a great anecdote as opposed to a research program.
Yeah, so on that note, Howard's question, you work on relationships. I imagine that when you present this kind of work, you sometimes get questioned about human analogs or something like that. How much of your research, either in terms of the kinds of interventions that you use or the kinds of outcomes that you're measuring or even the kinds of behavioral tasks that you have to develop to measure this kind of construct, how do you think about trying to use the methods that other researchers in your field use versus trying to borrow, like for example, like when you're looking at complicated grief, how much of it is trying to think about what would make sense to the human grief researchers versus what would make sense to your peers who study rodents?
So I'll use the specific example of grief that you brought up because I think it's a good one. So I was largely influenced by Kathy Shearer, who is a psychiatrist who works at the Columbia School of Social Work here. And she has developed therapies that are actually used in the treatment of complicated grief. And she's also shown that complicated grief is largely resistant to the standard treatments for depression, both therapies as well as pharmacotherapies. And so in that instance, the only other work that existed basically showed that if you isolate an animal, that it's fairly traumatic for the animal if it likes to be around other animals. This is true of mice, of prairie voles, etc. But I think then you're getting at what is the effect of trauma, and that's a great model for maybe PTSD or even depression for understanding some aspects of those diseases, but it doesn't get at what is the fundamental core feature of grief, which is this sort of unrequited or frustrated desire for reunion. And so it was through a lot of conversations with her interactions with people, sort of what the adaptive process looked like and what she felt was impeding that adaptation in people that had complicated grief that led to the idea that we should be focusing on social motivation. And that's where I was able to then say, okay, but we do have ways to study motivation in animals, and those are well worked out. So can we take this idea from psychiatrists and then merge it with all the work that's already previously been done in rodents to sort of adapt what we already know to measure what we want to measure.
Something that I think is common to all three of your research projects is either an interest in finding or just that your findings, some of which you've talked about today and just some of in your research, you find these kinds of reinforcing feedback loops where something that you do to target one individual in the relational structure ends up influencing another. And there are many difficulties of doing the kinds of research that you do in terms of recruiting a relational unit, but this is, I think, one of the benefits is that your effects also snowball, right? So I'm just wondering if you could speak to the kinds of reinforcing loops that sometimes happen in these relational structures.
I want to think about it for 1 second.
Okay. So one of the findings from clinical work with family therapy, a lot of which done here in New York, basically back in the day, family therapists saw families. They wouldn't see the couple alone. Over time, family therapists and researchers have found that you can influence the child's behavior by changing the parent's behavior. So most family therapy now is not really family therapy, it's couples family with an eye toward changing the child's behavior through parenting. So what we find, and we don't have great evidence for this, but that when you modify how the parents are communicating, how they're handling conflict, that even when you don't target parenting, it starts changing their parenting and starts influencing how the child behaves. And a lot of the large-scale government funding now actually targets couples, low-income couples, through relationship education targeted at the couple or parenting, but the overarching goal is to enhance the well-being of children growing up dealing with poverty-related stress and all the other factors that come with living in negative neighborhoods and just dealing with the stress related with poverty.
Okay, I got it. One thing I didn't talk a lot about, but was sort of the core principle of the way that we designed the interventions, was this idea that some students, some people are able to signal what the norms of a group are more than others, and norms are this perfect example of spillover effects or looping effects, feedback effects, because the idea is that we get our perceptions of what the norms in our social group are from lots of different sources, but the more frequent a certain behavior, the more we think that that is what the norm of the group is, if it's not being sort of immediately sanctioned. So in these kind of settings, right, like getting students to sort of take on, or anyone to take on a certain kind of behavior with the idea that that's shaping how other people think the norm works, is that you're also then getting their peers or whoever is linked to them to also enact that behavior, which has these downstream effects on other people who are observing them. So I think that's one of the one core way in which sort of this feedback loop happens in groups in particular.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think one thing that's really important to remember is that these interactions really are interactions. So even though at the beginning of my talk I talked about how we can buffer against stress, we seek someone out, they console us, we feel better, it turns out that that act of consoling someone who's experienced a trauma can actually transfer part of that trauma to the other individual. And so it's not a unidirectional thing. And so you see this fatigue of caretakers, among other things. And so this dyadic interaction goes both ways.
It's kind of interesting, but maybe we should give time to the audience for that.
Yeah, I have seen a few half hand raises, so I will, I'm sure, get to ask you more questions later, but let's open up to the crowd.
Can we just follow and ask, Hi, Zoe.
Hi, Peter.
Can we just follow and ask, it's a very one-sided setup you have. You have these sad tethered animals that don't have microscopes looking into their brains, but obviously they're engaged in something and unable to simulate and stimulate the relationship that's unfolding. So are you thinking about trying to understand how they're producing the couple that you're inducing?
Yes. So I do want to just clarify, it's not that these animals are living here with leashes. Like, they do this for the 20-minute test, and then the rest of the time they go off and they live with their partner in a normal sort of mouse cage. So we're not evil, that's to say. But during that interaction, so one of the things they can absolutely do is they emit these ultrasonic vocalizations that are outside the range of what we can hear, but we can detect them using a bat detector. And so we're just barely starting to do this, but starting to ask, is there a form of vocal communication going on that may even be signaling like, hey, I'm tethered, this really sucks, can you come and make me feel better? But yeah.
I think I have the mic. So this is a question that I'm usually asked and don't ask, but I'm curious about the effects of gender in each of your cases, and they're going to be different.
You've already spoken to this a little bit. I don't know if you want to follow up.
I'll wait to the end, so why don't each of you talk a little bit about that?
Okay. I mean, with respect to, so first of all, we don't generally think of rodents as having gender, but they do have sex differences. So you have male and female voles, and there are some differences in the underlying sort of neural substrates that contribute to how they form bonds. One of the stories that gets talked a lot about in the popular press is these hormones, oxytocin and vasopressin. And it turns out that vasopressin is much more important for male voles to form a bond with a female than it is for females. And there's a very simple reason for this. It turns out that vasopressin is regulated by testosterone, and so in male voles, they have a lot more vasopressin in their brains than female voles do. So you can get into the nitty-gritty of stories like that. What we can't really do is answer the types of questions related to things like relationship satisfaction, whatever that may be for a vole. Behaviorally, there are some differences. Our females tend to form bonds faster and stronger, meaning a stronger preference than the males do. And we haven't really dug into what might be contributing to that. You can make evolutionary arguments all you want. And the other thing is that they respond to stress differently. And so females take longer to form a bond in a stressful situation than males do. And we think that that's an evolutionary thing where if you're a male and you're in a stressful environment, you should try to procreate as quickly as possible because, you know, it's stressful and you don't want to make your babies. But if you're a female, you're investing a lot of resources, and so it may be a better strategy to wait because a stressful environment probably means fewer resources, and so it might be better to wait to reproduce. So I guess that was a long-winded answer to say that there are some sex differences in these species, and they're not particularly well understood. It's an active area of research. I'm very interested in it. But as you know, I've tried to sell the value of this model, and I don't want to undercut myself, but to say that some of these more complex features of relationships that we have as humans are going to be very, very difficult to try to understand from the perspective of a prairie vole.
What about grief?
What about grief? So we've only run female animals to date, and we did that partially because the females, as I mentioned, are faster and form stronger bonds, and so we wanted well-bonded animals to be able to ask some of these questions. So we haven't looked at males yet.
So we can talk about gender in a couple different ways in this case. So whether boys or girls are better at influencing their peers, whether boys or girls are more influenced by their peers, and then the interaction, whether if you see more people who are like you in terms of gender or other characteristics, are you more likely to be changed? And I can speak to the first and the last of those. So in our pilot study, we actually found that when we randomized these students to participate in this intervention, that the boys actually ended up being much more influential in shaping the beliefs of their peers, even though the behavior that we were actually asking about was a particularly girl-based behavior, which we called it starting drama before we totally understood the gendered meaning of that. But only girls in this model start drama, but the boys were actually the ones who were most able to change what their peers thought. So I think that's a local culture issue. Like that would happen in some schools and not others. So there's that piece. And then there's some work using our data by other researchers who have been looking at when there are more people in your grade of your gender and actually with your same GPA range in the intervention group, do you change your behavior more? And that seems to be the case. So the matching on those characteristics, but particularly important is matching on gender in that sort of framework.
Hi. So I have a question about this, the reward and motivation systems for social behavior. How do they relate to other reward and motivation system? Are they the same?
So we're looking at the exact same brain regions that you would look at if you were looking at motivation for food or other rewards. And so one of the first things we want to do is just simply ask, are there different populations of neurons that are potentially encoding different types of rewards within this brain region? And the reason that we're interested in that question is if there are different types of neurons that are reward active or involved in the motivation for these different things, it creates the opportunity to identify what is unique about that population of neurons and how could we potentially target it for an intervention so that you're not just wiping out people's motivation generally, but sort of facilitating adaptation within a specific population.
Do you, in the population of Prairie Voles, do you find an occasional vole that's not monogamous?
Yes. So the way that we do this is we put a male and a female together, and as I mentioned before, our arranged marriages typically work very well, but it does turn out that somewhere between in any given cohort of animals, 10 and 20% do not seem to form a partner preference. And I used to say, oh, well, the reason that we don't study these animals is because it's, 1 or 2 animals every time we run an experiment, except now I'm realizing that we are starting to get to the point where we may have a data set where we can say what's different about these animals. And if I can sidetrack for just a second, I think one of the really cool things about prairie voles is that in the wild, they sort of differ in how faithful they are. And so there's males that are super faithful, and then there are males that tend to stray a bit more, but we know that they still have a partner because they go back to the same burrow with the same female every night. But we know they cheat because you can do the genetics, right? And so we think that maybe this exists within what we call balancing selection from an evolutionary perspective, that there are times when it's more advantageous to be super faithful and times when it's more advantageous to be less faithful. And so I am curious within our colony where we have these outbred and genetically diverse voles, if our subset of non-bonders is maybe that same subset that's not particularly faithful when they pair up in the wild.
Kind of a related question for humans, couples. So are there people who identify as not monogamous who come to couple therapy? And
I don't have to answer that one.
Are there people who identify as non-monogamous who come to couples therapy? You like open relationships? Is that the question?
Well, I'm just asking what percentage of your couples identify or can recognize they are monogamous versus not, and maybe couples therapy is not useful for people who think that. Yeah.
Well, let me just kind of speak a little bit, and maybe I'll answer your question, maybe not, and we can talk later. But it's kind of interesting. You mentioned 20% maybe are non-monogamous. That's kind of the human data are 25% of men will cheat at some point in their relationship, married men, and 10% of women. So you get this kind of 2-to-1 ratio. So I don't know if you get that in the voles or not, with the males cheating more.
Voles, it's more equal.
But 95% of people say that they believe in monogamy, and that the non-monogamy in the context of a monogamous relationship is a bad thing. So, 10, 25% of people violate that, and it is one of the most devastating effects on a relationship, not because of the sex part, but the deception and the lying that goes along with most episodes of infidelity. So. But there are couples out there who try to practice an open relationship, and it tends to be difficult.
I had a question for Hana. I think it's really great the way you are doing these experiments, social experiments in schools. Yeah. I wonder if you could say something about how the actual structures, the differences between schools in their social connectedness, whether that matters at all for how the experiments have worked. Because I assume not all schools are the same.
Right. Yeah, no, the schools are actually very heterogeneous, and so that's one of the, we looked a little bit about mediating effects of the density of the network in the schools, and we didn't find a lot. I mean, I think there's still lots that can be done to try to understand what is there's lots of work on how different network structures shape diffusion, but in our data we don't see large treatment effects by network structure. So I think
so there isn't heterogeneity across schools.
There is heterogeneity in the underlying, the initial structure of the schools. But that doesn't help us explain the efficacy of the intervention.
Right, but the efficacy is different across schools, though all the same.
Oh, yeah, there's heterogeneity.
right.
Yeah, exactly.
Just-
But
yeah.
we can't map it onto
Yeah,
existing
gotcha.
network structure. Yeah, yeah.
As far as rewards go, for Howard, when you talk about children being a difficult part of marriage, is that how to raise the kids? Or to do it another way, if you present the couple to say that if your marriage is stronger, your kids will be better. So that gives them another incentive to, instead of just, me and you, it's the third person.
Yeah. We do actually find that there are a lot of couples out there who are motivated to work on their marriage because of their kids. And, the adage is don't stay together because of your kids. Our adage and what seems to work is that if you have a relatively healthy relationship, if there's not ongoing victimization like aggression, physical violence, infidelity, that we would encourage people to work on the relationship, if not for their own well-being, which would be enhance their kids' well-being. And so you find a lot of motivation for parents working on their marriage, in part for their kids. And for premarital interventions, which we do a lot of people say, well, I want to improve my marriage so that we're better parents, and that we know that if we get along better, our kids are going to do better. So kids are a major motivation for parents to do well in their relationships.
It's up for grabs.
All right, I'm going to sneak in a question. So one thing that I think is interesting, in thinking about things that are common between a rodent researcher and one human researcher, but not another human researcher, is that in Hana and Zoe, in your work, these are relational structures that your participants are kind of forced to be in, right? Like they're in this school, they didn't get to choose to be in this school. I mean, sort of, but they can't really leave. They're in this cage, they didn't have this choice. Whereas in Howard's marriages, or the marriages of his participants, they do have that choice. And I'm wondering.
One marriage at a time.
So I'm just wondering, in each of your work, how do you think about the elements of choice, either in terms of the relationship formation, choice in being a part of the relationship, or choice in being able to leave it? Like in Howard's work, obviously divorce is a major outcome, but that you don't have that same kind of outcome. And so I'm just wondering if you could speculate about, the counterfactual research program that you would have in a world where they did have that choice. Do you think it would be different for bullying, let's say, if kids could just leave the school instead of being the scapegoat for everything, or, leave the cage if, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, middle schools are sometimes like total institutions, but I mean, I think I think this is what, like, when you see turnover in friendships is really what, like, where there's movement in kids exerting choice, and obviously there's a lot of work on, the trade-offs between, or like trying to understand the relative effect of kids changing their relationships compared to being influenced in a network. So I'm not, let's see, I think what we know, though, is that the turnover is, like, there's lots of ways of measuring turnover in schools, right? Like teachers and kids leaving, and pretty much all of those metrics are net negative for kids. Like, I think one of the things that comes out is that there's this really kind of profound, like, value to stability. Which doesn't really answer your question, but talks around it.
Well done.
Caging the question.
Yeah.
Cagey answer.
Yeah.
I think if you ask me if it really matters that much, if we use arranged marriages or if we let them choose their partner in the lab, which I think is a little bit what you're alluding to,
Yeah.
that I would have said at one point of time, oh yeah, of course it's better if you let them choose their partner. And for some species, this really matters. When they talk about zebra finches, which are a monogamous bird species, their fecundity is much, much better if they choose their partner. But my colleague did an experiment where he put them into that choice test with 2 animals they didn't know, and half of them got paired with their preferred individual that they interacted with during that naive task, and half of them got the one that they didn't. There was absolutely no difference in the outcome. So whatever it is, whether it's that they're rodents or something else, or we're just not that sophisticated at measuring what they really want, it seems like we get a really robust bond in these animals, regardless of whether or not they got to pair up with their first choice partner.
Though we don't have random assignment in the couples field, that when there are cross-cultural comparisons in the stability and satisfaction of cultures where there are arranged marriages versus choice marriages, that in some cases, in some of these studies, that the arranged marriages actually do better. Now, there are any number of selection factors like religiosity, family support, and so on and so forth. But I would bet that if you did a survey of 20% of the single people trying to find mates in the country, that they would sign up for arranged marriages. So maybe you can talk with them.
Well, that's a new reality show, right?
All right, I'm being told that we've gone over our time, so we're going to continue our conversations with the speakers privately. But thank you so much to our speakers and to all of you for all of your great questions. Thank you so much.